As Abby Barty writes in The Gypsy as Trope in Victorian and Modern Literature, quote, "The gypsy is a ubiquitous figure in British literature, often functioning as a symbol of escape from the dominant social mores governing sex and gender roles in the ownership of capital. While images of gypsies," and I'm using the term in terms of the books I'm using as opposed to how we don't want to use the term, while images of gypsies indeed abound in 19th century non-Romani British literature, this paper aims to explore the figure of the gypsy in the imaginations of Jane Austen, Emily and Charlotte Bronte, and George Eliot, and to consider the role their novels play in continuing to construct racist ideas of Romanis in 21st century societies. By exploring 19th century British society's racist construction of the gypsy and drawing on the work of Barty, Deborah Epstein Nord, and Laura Moningham White, I intend here to explore, albeit briefly given the constraints of time, how the introduction of the figure of the gypsy, never referred to in these works as Romani, not only functions to further the plots of Austen's Emma, 1816, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, 1847, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, and George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss, 1860, but also allows the 19th century women writers who were expected to function as, quote, angels in the house, unquote, to fantasize about and other the gypsy when they themselves were othered by men who, like romanticized gypsies, were free to, quotes, wander outside the home. By projecting onto the gypsy their own desire for male freedom, for the exotic, for the wildness of the outside, and for not having to conform, these women writers contrast the representations of the gypsy with the safety of accepted British society without, of course, considering that their novels might continue to be read and taught in the 21st century, thereby continuing to portray members of Romani society from a racist perspective. By also considering the way these authors punish those characters portrayed as gypsies, such as Heathcliff, Mr. Rochester, and Maggie Tulliver, as well as the characters who encountered gypsies, such as Harriet Smith and Maggie, this paper begins to examine the ongoing problems inherent in such fictional representations and consider their relationship and influence on the contemporary attitudes toward Romani society. In Austen's Emma, Harriet Smith's encounter with gypsies furthers Austen's plot by placing Harriet in a position where, due to a leg cramp from too much dancing the night before, when she had been saved from social rejection by Mr. Knightley, she cannot escape the gypsies she encounters. Once Frank Churchill rescues Harriet from the ostensibly terrifying gypsies, he himself will become the target of Emma's matchmaking as she seeks a proper husband for Harriet. Because Harriet is of unknown parentage, however, and Emma Woodhouse is not as skillful a matchmaker as she herself would like to think, the culmination of the novel, as White points out, shows that Harriet's preference for Mr. Knightley's rescue over Frank Churchill's rescue of her demonstrates that, quote, in appropriating the gypsy's fortune-telling, Emma's own fortune as one self-deceived has been set, unquote. As White states, Austen employs in particular two constituent elements of the romantic archetype of the gypsy, the purported ability to tell the future and the purported desire to steal children, the latter suggesting the related fear of child stealing rampant among British New World colonizers, as reflected by the proliferation of Indian captivity narratives throughout the 17th and 19th centuries in the U.S. The gypsies' historical identity as putative invaders, outsiders who have no respect for English laws or class structure, is also important, according to White, for this identity underlines, quote, Harriet's illegitimacy and her role as a relative outsider in Highbury society. She is only a parlor boarder at a local school, as well as the fact that Harriet herself has some uneasy consonances with the gypsies who attack her. Later on in Emma, the presence of poultry thieves in the neighborhood, presumably gypsies, will allow Mr. Knightley, now engaged to Emma, to agree when they're married to move in with her and her father in order to protect them. Because Austen's Emma continues to be read and taught today on all levels, it becomes imperative that those who teach it recognize that the gypsy episode is not just, quote, an improbable and clumsy exercise of narrative intervention, unquote, as White states her students often believe, but rather a concise critique and refiguring of the romantic a tradition of the gypsy narrative as a whole, that by implication tells us much about the central characters, themes, and issues of the novel, underscoring the dangers inherent in marginality and in romantic imagination. However, because Austen's irony regarding Emma's matchmaking and use of gypsies to advance her plot is complicated by the anti-gypsy views of her characters, the kind of attention to othering and marginality seen in feminist and Native African American criticism, as well as Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, needs to be brought to bear in analyses and publications of Emma. In Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, the character of Heathcliff is referred to as a gypsy or a lascar, a sailor from India or Southeast Asia. Heathcliff, like Austen's Harriet Smith, is a child of unknown heritage, picked up on the streets of Liverpool by Mr. Earnshaw and brought home as a surrogate son to replace the firstborn Heathcliff who has died. Though Earnshaw says Heathcliff must be taken as a gift of God, he adds, quote, though it's almost as dark as if it came from the devil, according to Nellie, the somewhat reliable and only living witness. Upon Heathcliff's arrival, Mrs. Earnshaw questions, quote, how he could fashion to bring that gypsy brat into the house when they had their own bairns to feed and fend for. The child, described by Nellie as dirty, ragged, and black-haired, spoke some gibberish nobody could understand, perhaps Romani, I would venture to suggest. And Earnshaw explains that it was starving and houseless, and he was determined not to leave it as he found it. Not much later in the text, Hindley, the eldest living Earnshaw son who feels displaced by Heathcliff's arrival, angrily calls Heathcliff a gypsy, and a few pages later, when Heathcliff and Cathy are found peeking in at the Lintons at Thrushcross Grange, Heathcliff is treated badly while Cathy is considered royalty. Isabel Linton, who will, ironically, eventually marry Heathcliff, refers to him as, quote, exactly like the son of the fortune teller that stole my tame pheasant. And her mother exclaims about Cathy, quote, scouring the country with a gypsy, unquote. When Heathcliff later runs away and returns after a 3-year hiatus, only to find Cathy married to Edgar Linton, Nellie describes the grown Heathcliff as having a dark face and hair and sallow cheeks, while Linton calls Heathcliff a gypsy and a plowboy. Yet Nellie warns Linton not to call him by those names unless he wants to grieve his wife. Thus, though Mrs. Earnshaw, Hindley, Nellie, and the Lintons all damn the, quote, gypsy Heathcliff, Mr. Earnshaw immediately accepts him as more his son than his actual son, and Catherine Earnshaw considers him more herself than she is. Clearly, the untamed, fierce, defiant other here is both rejected and desired, and his rejection, based on class, inheritance, culture, and appearance, will presumably cause him to wreak his revenge on further generations of Earnshaws and Lintons once Cathy is dead. Given these references within the text to Heathcliff's ostensible gypsy heritage, it's rather startling to recognize that none of the well-known publishers of critical texts of Wuthering Heights, Houghton Mifflin, Norton, Bedford, include articles that focus on his treatment because of his racial identity as a gypsy, thus allowing students to ignore the anti-gypsy racism embedded in the text. Instead, Houghton Mifflin's critical volume, edited by Diane Long-Hovler, includes an essay on Wuthering Heights and the slave trade by von Snyden, which argues that Heathcliff was likely to have been the son of escaped African slaves and is treated as Cathy's slave, and the editor includes a note that states, Heathcliff's darkness and mysterious genetic origins have led many critics to speculate that he was intended by Bronte to represent the displaced, dispossessed others, whether Jamaican, Irish, African, or Indian, who had been used and exploited by the growing British imperialist interests, but who very well might in the future avenge themselves on the empire itself through seizure of its property and women. Though Romani were certainly forced to be slaves, historically, no attention is paid to Heathcliff's likely Romani heritage or how this affects our reading of the text today. For though Heathcliff may elicit our sympathy, he is also viewed by many as the archetypal demon lover who destroys a family, thus encouraging further stereotyping of contemporary Romanis. While Emily Bronte may characterize her so-called gypsy as somewhat sympathetic demon lover in constructing the plot of Jane Eyre, her sister, Charlotte, utilizes the familiar trope of the gypsy fortune teller, reinforcing the image of mystery and exoticism of the trope, as Ian Hancock, who we're happy to see today, has pointed out in his work. By having Rochester cross-dress as an elderly gypsy fortune teller, Bronte allows conversations to take place that would be otherwise impossible, thereby causing Jane to discover the growing love between her and Mr. Rochester. Dressed as a fortune teller, Rochester is described as black as a crock, a real sorceress, a tinkler, a witch, and a hag. And in the Bedford St. Martin's critical edition of Jane Eyre, a tinkler is negatively defined as, quote, an itinerant mender of pots and pans, usually a gypsy, a beggar. While Rochester himself in other scenes is described as dark as his wife Bertha Mason, his believable transformation into a gypsy woman further underlines his coloring as well as imagined Romani androgyny, and his decision to deceive his guests and Jane foreshadows his larger deception, the imprisonment of his wife, the so-called madwoman in the attic, and his attempted bigamy. Barty notes that by gaining access to an interview alone with Jane under false pretenses, Rochester's disguise challenges the social norms that prohibit a man and woman from being together unchaperoned. And his cross-dressing appears to efface his sexuality, permitting a level of intimacy with Jane that would otherwise be denied him and which constitutes a sexual threat. Thus, Rochester is likened to an Oriental despot and white chimpanzees and Oriental despots, racial stereotyping in Edward Rochester. Mishy's article included the above-mentioned volume, which opens with an apt epigraph from Homi Bhabha, the stereotyped other, by acceding to the wildest fantasies of the colonizer, reveals something of the fantasy as desired defense of that position's mastery. However, nowhere is the possibility of the othering of the gypsy discussed in these critical editions. For George Eliot's Maggie Tulliver and The Mill on the Floss, images of gypsy life familiar to those living in the countryside of England in the beginning of the 19th century represent a freedom and a sense of belonging Maggie longs for because she does not fit in being a girl, first of all, without the freedom and education her brother Tom has, as well as having dark curly hair, unlike her perfect blonde-haired and blue-eyed cousin Lucy. She's constantly likened to a gypsy by family members. Thus, in a fit of anger at her brother Tom's decision to favor Lucy over her, the young Maggie actually runs away to a gypsy camp where she naively imagines she will teach the gypsies all that she knows and will be their queen. Life in a gypsy camp, however, does not include familiar food or tea. Its inhabitants sometimes speak an incomprehensible language, and what has become a place of refuge and dominance in her imagination turns out quite differently in reality. As Eliot's narrator notes, from having considered them respectful companions, amenable to instruction, she had begun to think that they meant perhaps to kill her as soon as it was dark and cut up her body for gradual cooking. The suspicion crossed her mind that the fierce-eyed man was in fact the devil, who might drop the transparent disguise at any moment and turn into the grinning blacksmith, or else a fiery-eyed monster with dragon's wings. Although the gypsies she encounters include a gypsy mother more similar in appearance to Maggie herself, and her mother, and certainly more than her mother, the children might take her silver thimble from Maggie's pocket, serving as a symbol of the domestic gender roles Maggie hopes to flee. One of the gypsy men, nevertheless, respectfully brings her home and does not steal her, rape her, or present any of the other tropes. Yet Maggie's positive image of the gypsies has been transformed into fear, and in her imagination, the gypsy man becomes the devil, much as Heathcliff is described in Wuthering Heights. As Barty writes, the central paradox of 19th century representations of gypsies in Britain is that at the same time as they were characterized by so-called reformers as people who live like pigs and die like dogs, they were represented in literature as exotic, attractive, erotically charged free spirits whose traveling lifestyle was the subject of both envy and fear. And as Maggie's encounter demonstrates, the non-Gypsy community in 19th century Britain appears to have projected its fears of what it perceived to be aberrant and potentially destabilizing onto the trope of the Gypsy and then rejected it in order to shore up its own identity. I just need one more minute. Whether uttered as a gypsy, as in Heathcliff's case, disguised as a gypsy, as in Rochester's, frightened by gypsies, as in Harriet's case, or treated kindly by gypsies, as in Maggie's case, each character is in some ways ultimately punished. Not so long after her encounter with the gypsies, Harriet Smith ends up marrying the man she desired in the first place, a farmer, but below Emma's status. Heathcliff, though desired by Cathy, can't have her because of his status as an outsider, lives his life in misery. Rochester is ultimately blinded, burned, and exiled from the life he's led, though he does finally marry Jane, and Maggie Tulliver is an outsider for the rest of her relatively short life, only to drown with her brother Tom when the river floods. Furthermore, those whose teaching and editing these novels provide more of a context and criticism of the portraits of 19th century gypsies in the non-Romani community, unless those teaching it, the gypsy figure will continue to function as an empty signifier that can be infused with the projections of the dominant non-gypsy culture and will continue to be the targets of projection or abjection, the attempted rejection of what appear to be other, but are in reality parts of the self, as Julia Kristeva defines the term, much as various countries have attempted to control, reject, and expel gypsies as foreign, despite the fact that these gypsies are citizens of these countries and not foreign at all, and I'm quoting Barty. Clearly, the too prevalent omission of a critique of the gypsy trope, especially in the US, where much of the non-Romani population is not even aware of the presence of Romanis or their plight in Europe today, must be addressed. Thank you.